Hello and welcome to External Affairs.
Our second episode, and we are joined by a Canadian exchange student, James Coe, and two other students, Drew and Lucas. So, James, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm here for the year abroad from Canada, all the way on the west coast. That's Vancouver Island, Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, this is my second term. We've just started off. First term went excellent. I'm studying history and political science, more specifically, majoring in history and a minor in
Brilliant.
political science. So yeah, foreign policy and the like. It's all very interesting to me.
Brilliant. So, today we're going to talk just broadly about Canadian foreign policy, but also, in particular, peacekeeping and Canada's role in that, perhaps a few other implications. So, what I want to start off with is a concept that you mentioned in one of your dissertations that I read is liberal internationalism, and that
Right.
seems to be the center of Canadian foreign policy. I mean, what is liberal internationalism?
Yeah, so liberal internationalism, in a nutshell, it's a foreign policy doctrine. It really sort of emphasizes values such as cooperation, cooperative security, sort of the preservation of various institutions, be it the United Nations, NATO, what have you. Really sort of striving to spread and protect liberal democracy, open markets, and the like. It's probably the guiding doctrine for much of the Western world right now, and it is for Canada too.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Well, I think this is jump straight into it. A central case as well, with Canada and its role in peacekeeping, is the case of Cyprus.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Right. So Cyprus is one of the more well-known instances of Canadian peacekeeping. I'll make a long story short. There's the two ethnicities there, the Greeks and the Turkish on the island of Cyprus. Their claims to the lands go back and forth quite a fair bit, but really things there kicked off with independence in 1960, once the British formally left.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Over the next following years, there was a escalation in violence, spreading to the cities and whatnot. But 1964 was really when the situation worsened and peacekeepers were forced to come in.
Mm-hmm.
No, that situation hasn't been resolved to this day. It's a lot better than it was. I think it's been quite contained. But there was, for example, 1974, big escalation with a Greek coup, subsequent Turkish invasion. But 1974, they were able to establish, they called it the Green Line. It was really sort of a buffer zone that was held by the UN.
That's
yeah.
that's a really good summary. I think something as well in your dissertation, one on Cyprus,
Right.
particular, something that stood out to me is you said many issues of the Cyprus conflict remain unresolved and to this day. And Major General Milner, is he a Canadian general?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
He said that although the situation is much better than it was before, as they're no longer killing one another, the problem is still there. And you went on to say, you kind of raised a wider point, saying that conflict containment should not be the sole objective of peacekeeping operations, and there's not enough for a successful peacekeeping operation. Eventually, a resolution of underlying issues must take place. Is that correct? Is that what you said?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think initially when violence is erupting, you do need that initial containment for sure. However, for long-term solutions, I think other things need to be looked at. Is it realistic to have a UN peacekeeping force being there indefinitely? Probably not when you look at money and sort of all those factors.
Yeah.
So there is a definite need for sort of looking at the underlying issues, the ethnic tensions. But with that said,
are you
that is
talking
very
about
complicated.
addressing the root causes of conflict rather
I
than
think
treating
so.
the symptoms
I
of
think
it?
so. I think it's definitely easier to say than pull off. I fully acknowledge that. But only by addressing those root causes, however you want to go about doing so, could you actually stop the ongoing tensions.
Yeah.
But with that said, I still think the limited amount of things that peacekeepers could do, I think stopping that initial violence, it's not ideal for long term in various cases, but that is necessary ultimately as well. Yeah.
Like, that's really interesting. And to put that into a wider context, why has Canada been so involved in peacekeeping? I mean, they effectively invented peacekeeping, right? But now
They
they
did.
only have 60 soldiers
Yeah.
in the operation. Yeah.
Yeah, so Canada, it has been involved in peacekeeping historically. I think many Canadians do like to pride themselves on that. It's become a part of our national identity and sort of collective understanding of history, I think, in many ways. But to really understand how that came to be, I think you have to go and look back at the Suez Crisis, which occurred in 1956, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I could go into that briefly.
Yeah. Tell me a bit about that.
All right, so long story short, Nasser, president of Egypt, decides to nationalize the Suez Canal. This is really to increase his own revenue, pay off debts, irrigation projects, and whatnot.
And it was a very popular
Exactly.
policy
Exactly.
among Egyptians.
Yeah, but so that canal was previously owned by a Anglo-French consortium. So suffice to say, British, French weren't too happy about this. Israel attacks Sinai. The Brits and the French go into the canal itself. Now, interestingly, this action was actually condemned by the U.S. And the Soviets, for that matter. This needs to be, I think, understood in that Cold War context. You'd assume the U.S. has the U.K.'s back and sort of traditional Western allies. But in that Cold War context, they would like to gain Egyptian favor, I believe, sort of this play for influence. This isn't great for Canada. I think Canada's role as a middle power, they don't want this U.S.-UK rift. They don't want a rift between NATO, headed, it's debatable, but largely headed by the U.S., and sort of the Commonwealth countries headed by the U.K. Canada doesn't want this rift. Canada thrives best in a very stable international order. So, how are they going to solve this? Secretary of State for External Affairs, Lester Pearson, really advocates to the UN for a peacekeeping force. He really heads this, sort of gets it going, and this is the first peacekeeping force as we know it today. It was called the United Nations Emergency Force. So they deploy into Egypt. The United Nations Emergency Force really positions itself between the Egyptian and Israeli forces, stopping further conflict from escalating there. And slowly the crisis is resolved. That actually gained Lester Pearson the Nobel Peace Prize just a year later, 1957. And I'm not 100% sure, but I'm not sure if that's the only Canadian to have received a Nobel Peace Prize, but a big accomplishment for certain. But yeah, so I think really starting off with such a success really sort of laid the groundwork for future peacekeeping operations and garnered this image for Canada, which for decades afterwards, they really tried to uphold.
That's a really good introduction so far. Drew, Lucas, do you have anything to say at this present time? Not at the moment. Well, now on to, I guess, the elephant in the room is the Rwanda mission.
Right.
I mean, what happened there? I mean, why did it kind of fail? What happened with Canada?
Right. So if you understand Suez as a success, Cyprus is sort of a success to a degree in stopping violence, but sort of a mixed result long term. I think Rwanda was ultimately a failure, unfortunately. Basically, as I think most of our listeners and you are all aware of the Rwandan genocide, peacekeeping there started around that period. It was originally created to sort of maintain a temporary ceasefire between the Rwandan government and the RPF in October of '93. But that peacekeeping operation, they weren't really allowed to use military force. So when widespread genocidal levels of violence erupt, what are they to do? The peacekeepers lack mandates, they lack personnel, ultimately, equipment to prevent genocide, really the means to. They were sort of in a tough situation. So they really, all they could do was try and help individuals escape when they could. But yeah, overall, that was seen as a failure, I think, by the international community as they were unable to prevent this tragedy. Really, the Rwandan genocide, I think it was after 10 Belgians, peacekeepers, they were tortured and killed. Countries really began to withdraw.
Yeah. What about Canada itself?
I believe Canada was one of the bigger participants. I think Major General Dallaire wanted more troops, but I think slowly things began to withdraw as this sort of situation.
Right.
How that ends, I'm actually not.
Yeah.
I don't have the specifics or the dates in mind,
that's
but it sort of
understandable.
peters out. And I think they went back actually later. It was sort of almost a phase 2 of peacekeeping to try and help with humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
But that was also had mixed results. It wasn't
yeah.
super well received because I think some of the Rwandans felt that the United Nations had abandoned them before. So going back, there was definitely this sort of mixed sentiment.
But the UN received a lot of flack in Rwanda for being seen as its troops basically just kind of almost sitting back and letting it happen, because they sort of, there was that perception they didn't really have any kind of mandate to, or any kind of method to stop the violence and stop the killings. So I guess that raises the question: do you think the UN peacekeepers should be able to, or have the power, the authority to kind of step in directly?
Yeah, it is a very tough call to make. I think you definitely get into issues of sort of sovereignty, sort of can the UN go into somewhere and not just keep the peace, but actually enact in violent operations. That is a very tough call to make. I don't think I can make it one way or the other. I think in many ways you almost have to play it by ear. It's sort of a tough situation that peacekeepers are in. They have the means for violence, ultimately. They have weapons, and that is a necessary part of peacekeeping. But I think it would be best for their own image to largely be on the defensive. Because then you get into a whole other basket of, okay, are they keeping the peace, or are they just further escalating the situation? But no, that is it's hard. It's definitely a hard thing to balance. And I think the folks over in Rwanda definitely dealt with that issue, and other places too. During the breakup of Yugoslavia, I definitely have to touch on it in regards to Canadian peacekeeping. That one was particularly violent. The Medak pocket, all these different instances of violence. Canadians found themselves in firefights. I think I don't have the exact number.
Dutch UN peacekeepers even found themselves directly under mortar fire from Serbian forces. There was, I believe, some UN peacekeepers taken hostage as well at one point. It was
no, it's a tough situation because you're there to keep peace. But when you take direct fire, obviously you have to respond appropriately, for sure.
But who decides what is appropriate?
Exactly.
There's a big debate there. Yeah.
Well, this leads to a wider question, a tough one. It's okay if you can't answer it. I mean, why has Canada's role in UN peacekeeping declined? Why do they only have 60 blue helmets?
For context, some nations, I think Bangladesh has around 200 UN peacekeepers. Some nations have, more. Some have less. But given Canada's historic role, this kind of decline in number is a notable thing.
No, I think there is a definite myriad of reasons for their decline. Modern conflicts are a lot more complex. Maybe peacekeeping doesn't work as well. But as you said, other countries still have more peacekeepers, so why can't Canada? I think the previous failures we looked at, like in Rwanda, maybe damages public support. Maybe it's not something that the Canadian public wants. I don't know about this one as much because, like I said, Canadians do pride themselves on peacekeeping, but that is definitely something literature points to.
But do Canadians pride themselves broadly on human rights and diplomacy, like the Scandinavians do? In a way?
I think so. I think that definitely is a big sort of cultural pillar of Canada, is that we're sort of a new nation. We've participated in all these different global conflicts for the greater good. And we like to see ourselves as doing that. Sort of goes back to that whole liberal internationalism, how to be sort of a good international citizen and, still benefiting yourself and the world as a whole. But,
Well, before we go on to our break, our panelist Drew here has a quick question.
Sure.
If you'd like to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. It's sort of related to the question. It's interesting you mention that peacekeeping is, a matter of Canadian national pride. But with only 60 blue helmets, and in a world that's more fractured and more divided than ever, where do you personally see the future of peacekeeping and the future of that level of diplomacy being?
Yeah, I think it is, like you said, it's Canadian national pride, but I think it's definitely a historic pride. We sort of like to remember the good things. But to your point of sort of what's the way forward with peacekeeping, it's quite hard to tell. I think there's definitely a sort of lack of cohesive foreign policy, despite back in 2015, now Prime Minister Justin Trudeau actually promised to renew peacekeeping, even so much as accusing Harper of turning his back on the world. But as we've seen, this hasn't been kept completely, which is quite disappointing. But I think there's been also even sort of a larger decline domestically in Canada when you look at housing costs, costs of living, inflation, military capabilities overall. So I think maybe the way forward for Canada would be to maybe fix itself before it tries to effectively fix the international community. I think that would probably also garner a lot more support domestically. I think Canadians are quite concerned about their own domestic issues. And sort of when you look at, difficulties in healthcare, they might sort of question, okay, why are we doing this abroad? But ultimately, I think fixing domestic issues is a big one. Sort of foreign policy, looking at forming a cohesive plan for that. But I think also another thing that does have to be mentioned is that maybe Canada's just taking a different approach. Maybe they're looking at more sort of NATO-led initiatives and taking other foreign policy routes that aren't explicitly UN peacekeeping. I think that is another definite possibility.
Yeah.
But so yes, like I said, there is a whole lot of reasons for the decline in peacekeeping. It's hard to single out any one in particular. But no, I think it would be nice. It would be nice if Canada could sort of reclaim its position as sort of a humanitarian beacon in the international community.
That's a really good answer. Thank you. Do you have time for one more question before the break?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So I got another question. We just mentioned because Canada has only 60 peacekeepers during the time.
Right.
But because of technological development nowadays, do you believe with more advanced military hardware, it will help to change the tide? So maybe we can see from the Ukraine war, the Ukrainians use drones or more advanced armor equipment to defend and to attack, to repel the attackers. So do you believe in the future if, not say like personnel, but like the Americans or maybe other foreign countries will donate such advanced equipment to the United Nations, and then Canadians can also use such equipment, or like other NATO countries can also use this equipment? Do you think despite having low personnel, they can still establish a wide range of peacekeeping activities?
No, I think that is a possibility. I think as technology increases, and maybe looking in different spheres of technology that weren't around back in, especially the 50s, but even sort of a bit more recent ones like the 90s. I think that advancement of technology could definitely have an ability to peacekeep, or even if it's not peacekeeping directly, playing some role in stabilizing the international system. So, for example, I don't think it wasn't explicitly mentioned, but if Canada took a approach to, for example, look at sort of how to defend from cyber warfare, for example. That wouldn't require personnel. It would require money still, sure, but projects that could be developed on Canadian soil rather than putting boots on the ground abroad. If such a system was developed and shared with other countries that maybe can't develop that for themselves, I don't know how that would look. This is obviously just sort of hypothetical at this point, but it'd be an interesting way to sort of peacekeep in a way without it being traditional peacekeeping, sort of just aiding other countries in technological ways that don't require soldiers per se. I think it was in your question sort of talking about donating equipment. I think, you're right. We definitely have seen that in Ukraine. But I guess it's it's almost a different basket of foreign policy rather than peacekeeping. It's sort of this foreign aid approach to things, which I think Canada has definitely been doing. We've contributed a fair bit of money. I'd say I don't have the exact numbers, but money and equipment for that conflict. But yeah, well, I think there's also a case Canada itself, actually, they have to improve their own military in terms of technology. Submarines, I think on the West Coast we have only a handful of submarines. I don't think we could defend our Arctic sovereignty up there if we had to, if push came to shove. There's sort of a...
Well, to reassure you, I'm sure the Canadian Navy and military is far more competent than the South African one. So
Probably, yeah.
if you ever feel useless, just look at South Africa.
Yeah, but yeah, no, I think, yeah, I guess it's a bit of a tangent to your question, but in terms of Arctic sovereignty, I guess there is an over-reliance on, well, I don't know if it's over-reliance or a strategic reliance on the United States in defending that area.
Perhaps you can touch on that after the break.
Yeah,
That's
I think
a really good question and really good, quick question as well, Lucas. Really good answer to it. Should we take a break there then?
Yeah, so we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with our rolling discussion on Canadian foreign policy and UN peacekeeping. Welcome back to External Affairs. We're continuing our discussion on Canadian foreign policy with, I think we're going to go to the Arctic Circle now. Which is
So what can you tell us about Arctic security?
Right, so the Arctic security, I think that is definitely a big sort of emerging issue. We've seen a lot more countries sort of setting up there, ones that aren't even necessarily, Canada or Russia. Okay, they're right next to it. It's sort of understandable why they'll have land claims, but you'll see sort of other countries trying to get their stake there. I think Arctic security is a big issue in the coming years, especially when you look at Russia, for example. Their maybe decision-making or territorial claims, I think, are a bit more unpredictable as they were probably a decade or so ago.
Yeah, and does climate change make that even more unpredictable with
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right.
Melting?
I think sort of assuming ice melts or continues to, I'd be guessing that would unveil a lot of resources in the Arctic, or at least in the surrounding areas. I think whatever that may be, oil, what have you, I think there would be a definite resource grab, an opportunity for countries to profit a fair bit. Canada already, likes to focus on energy production of oil, uranium, or whatever. So that would be certainly a good spot for them to capitalize on. So I think in that regard, it's very important Canada steps up its game in the Arctic and sort of asserts its sovereignty where those assertions could be made, so that in the future, when that land is useful, it's in Canadian hands. I mean, just look at example, Alaska. When it was sold to the U.S., it seemed like a barren wasteland, whereas now it definitely serves a good role for the U.S. in terms of energy. So that could be applied to the Arctic more broadly in different parts. Obviously, it won't be everywhere. But that is something that I think has to be considered.
And you were talking about the current state of Canada's Navy earlier.
Yeah, no, the Canadian Navy, it is, I am proud of it ultimately. They're all good people, but I question if we have the capabilities to make it all the way into the Arctic and defend ourselves if push came to shove. I think our submarines are quite old. Admittedly, I think there's a conversation that has to be had there about upgrading their capabilities, especially when you see, Russia to the north, China, their presence there. I think Canada does need to step up its game. I think there's probably been a bit of it's a tough situation. It definitely is a tough situation. I almost want to say over-reliance, but it is also good for Canada to sort of rely on the U.S. I think that is probably, obviously I can't get in the head of Canadian policy decision makers, but I think they assume that, God forbid, there's any conflict, the U.S. would have our backs.
Yeah.
But
But I
Yeah.
just wanted to also ask you about something there. Isn't Canada, along with Macron in France and a few other European nations, kind of wanting to exert sort of a path of not being so dependent on the US?
yeah, no, I think there is definitely that needs to be taken into consideration, and that's an issue. When you rely on a country for your protection, how far could you realistically stray from that country in terms of foreign policy, or even domestic issues to an extent? Not necessarily militarily, economic issues. We saw NAFTA be reworked. You know, if the U.S. wants to place tariffs on Canada, they could easily do so, and Canada can't do much back. You know, I think it's sort of a good way to look at our situation. If the White House phones Ottawa, you know, Ottawa's going to pick up. If Ottawa phones the White House, you know, the White House might not always be there to pick up the phone. I think we have a great relationship, and I'm not going to knock it. I think it's one of the best in the world. But there is a definite imbalance that sort of means
What would
maybe
what would a Trump presidency mean? A return of Trump to the White House?
term.
Yeah.
Do you think that relationship would be increasingly unreliable, or do you think it would be downright gone?
I think Trump. Are you talking about in 2016 or in 2024?
In a hypothetical second Trump term.
That is interesting. I think the best way to predict what would happen would be looking back. So, like I mentioned, reworkings of NAFTA. I mean, Trump's a businessman. He's going to try and do what's best for the states, even if that means what's not necessarily best for Canada, right? So, whether that means playing hardball, putting tariffs on countries like Canada for certain products, or I think there's an instance like you brought up France, for example. I think putting tariffs on whatever champagne if France tries to put a tariff on a U.S. product. So I think Trump definitely seemed to sort of play hardball and be a bit more aggressive in terms of what was best for his country economically. But obviously, you know, Canada's not America, so having a politician that way inclined might not always end up being the best for Canada. So that is definitely something to be taken into consideration, I would say.
And can we move on to the subject of climate change? What threats does that pose to Canada, and what role is Canada playing? What role will it continue to play in the fight against climate change?
Right. No, I think Canada has. Obviously, we are in the energy business when it comes to oil. However, I think Canada is a country that is set up to tackle climate change quite well. I think oil production isn't going to be going anywhere in the near future, even if it's bad for climate change. That's just not a viable transition that could occur. So I think in that regards, I would actually suggest Canada continues and allies start relying more on Canada and relying less on maybe sort of hostile oil producers. I think by having an allied oil producer, it sort of sets us up for a situation where the best measures possible to preserve the climate could be taken with sort of scrutiny and supervision, and then slowly weaning that out. I think another place Canada could accelerate in regards to and do quite well in regards to climate change is uranium. We have some tremendous uranium mining and production, the ability to sell around the world and sort of go nuclear, to be honest. I think that would be a viable pathway forwards in terms of the climate issue. It's relatively green. I think it gets a lot of a sort of a bad rep, but for a realistic approach to climate issue, I think maybe looking more into uranium could be a good idea and would also be beneficial to Canada. I think lots of uranium in the prairie, so that would be good. But in terms of the effects of a warming climate, I haven't looked too much into it. I could tell you Canada's quite cold, so maybe it wouldn't be horrible.
Even colder in the winter and even warmer in the summer, maybe?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I think assuming temperatures get warmer and warmer, ocean levels rise, I think that'll be especially problematic in sort of developing countries or sort of island nations that are close to the sea level. That is a big issue. I think that'll sort of wreak havoc.
Yeah.
And Canada might have to do something to aid
Well,
that.
that leads me to ask:
Yeah.
do you know what, if anything big happened with Canada at COP28 in the last year?
Oh, right.
Yeah. Not any
Truth.
knowledge.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Truthfully, I haven't followed that super closely.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I would say, going off that, sort of tying it back to that liberal internationalism I talked about,
Yeah.
I think Canada does try to go about issues with this very sort of multilateral
Yeah.
approach.
Promotes cooperation. And,
So
yeah.
sort of international meetings, sort of setting these targets to meet. I think that definitely goes back to that sort of foreign policy doctrine. It's an example there.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments or questions at this point in time?
Yeah, I noticed most of your stuff about climate change was focused on oil policy and uranium. Doesn't sound particularly green to me unless you're talking about weaning them out, in which case the economic benefits to Canada would be negligible, basically. Just drill a bit more into that. I'm not intended, by the way.
Yeah. Well, no, like I said, I think uranium done right isn't actually too bad in terms of sort of emissions and in terms of climate change. But you know what? There is definitely other energy production formats. There's tons of natural gas out there. Hydro, I think, is one of the most. I think it's a very big producer of electricity, especially in British Columbia, where I'm from. So there is other venues to look at. But I think my bigger point there was that assuming oil needs to be used, countries should be turning to somewhere such as Canada and using their oil instead of other countries that maybe don't always have the best interests of that sort of allied Western world in mind. And that by using Canadian oil, ideally, or at least in theory, we would have quite a fair bit of bureaucratic oversights that allow it to be done right, or at least is sort of environmentally safe as one could deal with oil. But it is a tough situation because you can't just abandon the energy sector. That'll leave quite a fair bit of people unemployed, damage the economy. So I guess in that regards, it is fairly precarious. I guess there's a conversation to be had about weaning that out. I think the Canadian government, I think it was 2030 something, for example, trying to transition away from petrol using cars entirely. So there are steps being made, but I think it is a slow process, and you could blame politicians, but then there is also the question of if it just has to be a slow process, if it is sort of too tough to do anything drastic.
I think it should be worth mentioning as well, Canada is, while its oil industry is about, I'm getting 7.58% of GDP of its economy is based on the oil industry, it is also one of the most forested countries in the world, something
That's
like
true.
40% coverage
That's true.
with forests, so it is in a fairly good position to reach net zero.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the thing is I think any country in the world you could sort of pick apart what they could do better, but ultimately I'd say Canada's done a fairly good job, especially when you compare it to I won't go into details, but especially when you compare it to other countries that maybe don't have the same sort of moral or environmental concerns.
There's some that are still kind of, over 60% reliant on coal for their
Right,
energy.
right.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Great response.
Thanks.
We have a question from Lucas now.
So regarding about the Arctic region, some experts stated if the Arctic continue to melt, you were able to open new routes for shipping lanes to travel and reach Canada more easily than around the globe. Would you feel this as something, a way to establish a tie with other countries, or you think it's like a chance that will endanger the Canadians' economy?
I think if ice in the north melts and they are able to make some sort of Northwest Passage that could go through, I think that would be tremendous for trade. But I think the one issue there, and sort of touches back on that sovereignty issue I mentioned earlier, is that something Canada could accurately control the flow of? Or, I'm sure they might already, but, submarines from China or any other country that sort of aren't necessarily telling Canada they pass through. There's sort of a definite conversation there that has to be had about Canada's ability to patrol its own oceans and enforce its sovereignty, and making sure that if such a passage is created, that it can be done so safely and ideally in some way benefiting the Canadian economy. I don't know how that would look. I don't know if that would be a toll or something. I don't know if that would be sort of a bit too much of a stretch, but there is already even passage through Canadian land. Like the U.S., for example, they'll do what they wish to in the Arctic Circle. There's a bit of a gentleman's agreement where they'll ask us and we'll always say yes. But I don't know if we've seen it in news, but I almost guarantee you there are state actors sending vessels, submarines, what have you, through Canadian land, which we don't notice. And sort of this goes back to, this isn't necessarily the Arctic or the ocean, but the balloon, the Chinese balloon that sort of passed down through, is it British Columbia, Alberta, what have you, passed down through there into America. Why was this picked up, or at least knowledge made available to the public? It was picked up in, I think it was Montana, maybe somewhere in the States, or maybe it might have been a bit further south.
Yeah, I think there was a nuclear facility in Montana, which it sort of was spotted over.
So that is a massive security failure on Canada's behalf, especially in the context of NORAD, where we're supposed to be sort of observing and protecting on behalf of the states. I don't know if they had knowledge of it behind the scenes that just the public doesn't know about. But from the information we do have, it seemed like a massive failure to let such a thing simply fly over, sort of unaddressed. It wasn't sort of, they waited so long to shoot it down that it probably gathered any sort of, information it was allegedly gathering.
Yeah. All right, we're going to take another quick break and then we'll be back with our discussion. Hello and welcome back to External Affairs. So continuing our discussion, has anyone got a question?
Yeah, so I've got a question on, do you think Canada as a whole gets a little less slack and a little more rap from the international geopolitical community over climate change and over the Arctic? Do you perceive this as unfair? Do you think it even exists in the first place? Firstly, I guess, to ask.
Right. I think just like any other developed nation, especially being a part of the G7, Canada does get scrutinized to an extent over the decisions it makes. But I think in terms of slack, like you mentioned, I don't think it's so much so that people consciously give Canada slack. I think it's just sort of a combination of Canada maybe being overshadowed by the U.S. and the decisions Canada does make are maybe less impactful than other sort of countries such as the U.S. So, yeah, unfortunately, it's probably sort of more just a situation of being overshadowed by the neighbors to the south. I think the decisions they make largely impact the world more so just because of their position geopolitically. And oftentimes, truth be told, a lot of Canadian decisions might be in line with those of the United States. So when you're looking at it from a journalistic perspective or just sort of, just sort of brief talking points, I think people tend to, at least to my knowledge, people tend to look at the United States and just sort of assume Canada's following a similar protocol, almost more of sort of, I'm trying to find sort of the right, sort of appropriate word for it, but maybe just sort of, just sort of following what the States do. So people just look at the States and assume that's what Canada will also be doing, perhaps.
Yeah.
So give it slack in that regard. I think a lot of people don't actually follow Canadian foreign policy and especially domestic policy that closely when there's so much else going on in the world.
Does anyone know much about New Zealand foreign policy, let alone Australian
Well, exactly.
foreign policy?
Exactly.
Canada and the US is like Australia and New Zealand in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely. I mean, with so much going on in the world, it's definitely easy for some countries to be overlooked while others get in the spotlight. And, to an extent, rightfully so. I mean, United States obviously makes massive contributions in the world in terms of sort of their military decisions, political decisions, economic decisions, what have you. And I guess people, unless you do deep dives and unless you like foreign policy like all of us here, a lot of people won't take the time to read that, CBC or, article.
Yeah.
It's a bit sad, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
That, we will and they won't.
Yeah, exactly.
They hate us because they ain't us.
Yeah, that's it. Right.
Well,
On another question. Do you think there's been a bit of a, I don't want to say fragmenting, but a sort of a slight decline in US-Canadian relations, particularly when you look at sort of Canada not getting involved in the Iraq War? They didn't send at least to the best of my knowledge, they didn't send a ship to Prosperity Guardian, the sort of NATO-led task force in the Red Sea. So do you think that's is that just a coincidence, or is that emblematic of a wider issue?
I think Canada and sort of the Western world, specifically the United States, I think we do still have a very good relationship, just because there's such a big mutual economic benefit there that, sort of small political squabbles might not interfere with. But no, to your point about, Canada, used to play a big role in NATO, used to play a big role in all these different international institutions. But and recently, like you said, and then I also think there was another one, I don't remember the exact acronym, but I think it was United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, and that was for defense in
the submarine, nuclear submarine.
So
AUKUS Pact.
I don't think it is so much a degradation of that relationship or sort of any hard feelings. I think, frankly, it's just they figure, hey, you know what? If Canada can't get itself in order, they don't have the military spending or military capabilities, there's no point in inviting them to the table where they'll just be a reliability, they'll just be sort of unreliable, or maybe the other countries will have to sort of step in for them. So I think it's just purely from that perspective, that if we don't have the means or capability to effectively be useful abroad.
And do you think that's because of a particular event or a diplomatic issue, or is that just
I don't think
because
so.
of the sort of decline in
I
defense?
think it's just a sort of a slow decline in defense. Sort of maybe the lack of sort of concentrated political will, foreign policy.
But what about ideology? Because I mean, there seems to be almost no new big ideas, or at least not that I know of. But I'm aware the country's last foreign policy review was in 2005.
Oh right, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's another problem with Canada is that maybe we've just been too sort of stagnant in foreign policy. I think there's sort of it's almost sort of this proclivity to say, hey, we're a developed Western country, things will work out all right. Obviously, they don't. Trudeau said the budget will balance itself. Obviously, it didn't. Has he applied sort of a similar sentiment to military? Maybe he has. I haven't seen too much big sort of improvements. So it's sort of this awkward situation where we have these domestic issues. We don't have sort of a concrete foreign policy perspective. Either amongst the civilian population itself, we're torn on what to do, and probably amongst the politicians also. They're sort of torn what to do. So we don't have, there's no sort of, going back to the Suez at the beginning of this hour, there's no sort of Lester Pearson character to sort of rally Canadians behind sort of a common idea that sort of could be accomplished within, and that's the functional principle, right? Canada should engage in issues that meet its capabilities. If you don't have good capabilities, you're not going to be able to meet a lot of issues in the international community.
Any other questions at this point in time? No. Well, there is one final section. Is just what are your views as an individual, not necessarily Canada's views, but as a Canadian on the generic sort of mainstream world order issues like the rise of China and Ukraine? What does that mean for you as a Canadian?
Yeah. So I think Canada, I think should continue to strive for its position as a middle power, a helpful fixer, sort of preserve international law, value international organizations, take multilateral approaches to things, emphasize values of diplomacy, just be a good international citizen all around. I think that's what we have done, and ultimately, I guess, is what we should be continuing to do. But in the wake of such big issues, I mean, these aren't small sort of bushfire wars. They're very big players getting involved, like, you know, Russia and Ukraine, tensions, in sort of China and sort of that surrounding area, you know, Israel, Palestine, sort of a lot of big sort of issues and sort of global instability going on, which is probably not great for Canada. I think Canada thrives sort of at a stable status quo.
Yeah.
So when there's so much uncertainty, it's bad for Canada. So going back to my point about sort of domestic issues, I think Canada should work on those and then be able to address issues abroad. With that said, that doesn't mean just abandon the sort of international community. I think you could do both quite effectively. But it's sort of a question of getting yourself in order domestically so that you are able to then help internationally. But yeah, no, overall, in terms of sort of foreign policy, I think Canada would be best to do what it's always done, which is sort of stop allied conflicts from erupting, whether that's resolving the Suez crisis so the US and UK get on well, whether that's resolving Cyprus so that Greece and Turkey get on well within the context of NATO. Just doing whatever we can for international stability, but also stability at home. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. And also, you've told me in the past that you're actually interested in a career revolving around foreign policy, maybe the intelligence service.
Right.
Do you want to tell us a bit about your career ambitions and how that relates to foreign policy?
Well, maybe they're a bit. They are a bit ambitious. I think you're right in the word choice there. But no, that would be. I am a student of history and politics. Those are two subjects which interest me quite a fair bit. I'd love to do something with Canada in that capacity. However that takes place. I mean, I guess we'll see how that unfolds. I guess for now, it's just work hard.
Is foreign minister too ambitious?
We'll see. No,
watch this space, folks. 20 years, there might be a new foreign minister in Canada.
Yeah, no, that would be nice. You know, I'm quite humble, so I'm able to acknowledge I definitely don't have the answers to everything. But it'd be nice to, you know, try and help my country where I can in the future.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you all very much for tuning in, those of you who did.
Thank you for joining us, James.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you, James. Thanks to Drew and Lucas for joining us as well.
Thanks for having us on.
As panelists. And see you all next week.